Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 114. The topic is Digital Rights in the Age of AI Agents. Quick reminder to support the live stream. A good way to do that is to follow the live stream on LinkedIn. Our guest today is Joshua Corneco, an information and knowledge architect from the UK. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, thank you very much for having me today. It's been quite a while since we originally organized this event. I live, as you have said, I live in the UK. I live near London, Um and sort of rolling back to the very beginning. I have been living in England for around 25 years, and I started my career in the UK in working for a startup that was sort of like Netflix. So they were as the aspiration was to create a digital media company that would provide video on demand and broadcast to clients. So I worked for them for around 7 years. Then I moved to work for a larger telecommunications company, Verizon. Here in Europe, it's not very well known. It's more on the business side, and afterwards, I slowly got introduced into the authorization space, starting in the supply side, where companies sell data to other companies, mostly in the financial space. And a lot of the modeling in there is about the permissions and the prohibitions that the seller has over the client, but also the obligations that the client has for compliance towards whatever the permissions and the prohibitions. So it's a much larger problem space than the traditional access control or authorization, where you're trying to enable the user to, or the machine, the agent, to read or write something. In this case, you have all sorts of other types of actions that can be executed, and also you have a lot of obligations depending upon who you are and what you're doing. There's some very interesting edge problems in this space as well, like concurrent access, or now as we're moving into the AI era, you start looking at things in terms of the fragmentation of information, where you have a document that is part of your system, and you pass it through a RAG, and now you have little chunks that are connected somehow, and those chunks don't really exist in your asset catalog. So it's a fascinating problem space, the way I see it.
I want to take a quick step back and ask you about ODRL, because that's actually in the long title for this episode. What is ODRL, and maybe you could give us a little bit of its history?
Sure. So ODRL is the Open Digital Rights Language. It was created around 25 years ago, and it was mostly the original focus was to manage or control the access over media assets. Um, the guy that created, or one of the guys that created it, was Renato Iannella. He lives in Australia, so he's probably sleeping now. And it has been a slow progressing standard. So the first version was adopted by IPTC for media. So parts of ODRL has been already adopted by the media companies or the media institutions. And it has evolved. Being a standard is very slow moving. So if you think about a standard that is 25 years old, but it has only had three versions, uh, that is, I suppose, that's the nature of the beast when you're trying to get everyone to agree. Um, it's a W3C standard. The current version is 2.2. And as we're going to speak at the end, there's a starting to build version 3.0. There's in the last 24 months, I would say, there has been a lot of interest from other institutions to start looking at a protocol or a standard way of expressing policies, where you're sharing data between companies, which is probably a novel problem. Uh,
Josh, maybe I could take a step back and just ask. So this sounds like a standard that would be very useful for artists. Um, so, for example, if I'm an artist, I want to make sure that I always get a credit if my art is used. Otherwise, I can get an audit done of your organization, and that would be very inconvenient. So it seems like this ODRL standard, sort of evolves to make sure that the people who are using these assets, understand that they have these obligations. Um, so I understand the artist use case. Why do banks care about this? Why do financial institutions care about ODRL?
It's a similar problem. So in the case of the financial institutions, you're talking about a seller of data that is giving access to that data to a client, and they are also saying, well, I want you to use this data in certain conditions. It could be streaming data that you're not allowed to save. So those are conditions that you have to comply. Maybe a very simple example, but there are plenty of other conditions. Attribution, which is something that is very common in artists. It could be also common in the financial institutions where I'm providing data to you. Um, I don't know, a news article that you are broadcasting in the application that you're using for finance. Apple, when you are looking at the Apple stock, I would like you to attribute me as the owner of the article that you are displaying inside your application. So it's sort of homologous, just like the main difference is that artists care about assets at little scale, images or multimedia, audio, whilst institutions care about data sets that are much larger because you're looking at the consistency. And there will be obviously also assets that are minute, like news articles, but those are ancillary to the main rules.
Let me ask sort of a basic question. In the past, we always think about access control. Can I get access to it or not? But it sounds like what you're describing is something maybe one step down, which is purpose control. You can use it, but do you think that we're moving towards sort of a new model away from access control to purpose control?
I do think so. Yes, I think the future. I posted on LinkedIn regularly. I think the era of the open internet is sort of coming to an end because of the way that AI companies have taken all the data that is publicly available and done whatever they want. And you can see that that's a solution that people are looking for is a way of controlling that. So the purpose. I want to know the purpose of why are you coming to my environment and capturing all my data as the common example of robots.txt,
Mhm.
where so far has been gentleman's agreement where people say, well, if I have this little file and I said that you cannot do this, don't do it. But moving forward, I want to know the actual purpose. And if you come, there should be a way for me to be able to reconcile who has come and what they're doing and going. If I find out that by an audit that you're doing something incorrect, I have now proof that you are doing things that you shouldn't be doing with my data. So it's yeah, purpose is a good word to use.
So ODRL actually sort of formalizes this permission model, and how does it compare to RBAC or ABAC types of models? Like, what is it? Is it directly analogous?
I would think that ODRL is more on the policy PBAC. So they are is a focus is a little bit more generic, but because of the way that the language has been modeled, you could do ABAC if you wanted to, as long as you are aware that you're creating complexity to yourself. So it's just like any ABAC system, you're creating a lot of complexity in order to track the attribute that you want to do. But you could well create a policy where you have an asset or you have an asset catalog and then you just go attribute based on that
Hmm.
asset. But you can also do role based because you can define the different roles that an agent is going to have. And I'm talking about an agent in a very generic way. It could be a machine, but in principle you have like the basic ones is like the assigner, which is the owner of the asset, and the assignee, which is going to be the user. But then you have a hierarchy of types of agents, and you can also go not only on the attributes of the asset that you're trying to purpose control, but also you could do on the user, on the agent. So you can also define attributes on what are the conditions for that purpose. So you can have um, say that the user has to be in the office in order to access the asset. All that can be expressed in one single policy if you wanted to.
Yeah. Interesting. Um, so, okay. Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that these um, policies, there's going to be a little bit of friction whenever we map them from whatever it says in the ODRL specs to whether it's ABAC or RBAC. Um, why do you think maybe a graph approach might be the best way to represent what the ODRL spec can do?
Sure. So I think that the main reason or the main aspiration of the graph is that data anyway is connected as a graph. So when you're defining your assets, and even when you're defining your agents, those agents, as you expand them to their limits, they become a graph. It's all about the relationships between the user and the assets, and between the assets and other assets, between the assets and the functions that they could deliver and the ones that they're actually delivering in policies. So you're creating already a spider web at that level. So there's no, it's a natural coupling when you're also saying, well, I'm just going to do mapping from my policies. And a
Right.
policy is a graph of rules, and the rules are a graph of constraints, and the constraints or the assets that are refined are all connected also as a graph.
Hmm. Well, so it seems like it would be better to, in terms of evaluation, maybe it doesn't matter, but in terms of being able to say, what resources can this person actually control, like going the other direction and searching it, graph might be a lot better. Do you agree with that? Is
Correct.
there, yeah,
Yes. Yes, you could look at the graph again. Being a graph, you can come at it from any direction as long as you have a point of reference. You can do the audits in a single tool as well. You can define, well, I want to know everyone that can read a specific asset. That's a simple graph query. But I also want to know what are all the actions that can be performed over an asset, and who can perform those actions. That's also just a single query. So you are creating the auditability of your state of data, or and even infrastructure, in one single language, in one single location. You don't have to go across multiple places to find out where is this running, and who can access, and what can they do, and when was the last. I mean, maybe the timings or the telemetry can be separated so you don't overwhelm the graph. But effectively, if you have a link between one and the other, you can do that. Um,
Now, one thing that I always wonder about graph solutions is I agree that it's really useful on the enterprise side to have a graph, but you can't embed an RDBMS inside a mobile application. So any graph solution is inherently non-embeddable. Do you agree with that?
yes, although I think Samsung has purchased a graph company recently, so that you can embed a little RDF graph inside your Samsung phone. Uh, but part of the work that has been done, for example, in the media space, is to have the ability to, when you have a multimedia asset, to either describe the policy inside, so it's sort of separated, and you just go onto the internet to fetch the information that is missing when you need to, so you can effectively still work in the same way as you work today when the asset has low value. But
Hmm.
also you could think that the reference to the policy is external. So in order to actually access the asset, you have to go to the internet and request all the information. It's not embedded in the asset, so that allows you to track the usage, because that trip that you have to do to fetch that information
Hmm.
has to take place, and it's obviously auditable and everything that comes with it.
That's very interesting. Um, So you're saying that basically the PDP might have to fetch data in order to be able to evaluate its policy, like make sure that this particular end user is not on a export restriction list or something, right?
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Um,
And you can have again PDP and PEP embedded or separated. As we spoke earlier about the fact that the purpose, you also have the obligations. You can create very interesting scenarios. One of the ones that I found very interesting is when you create a phantom protocol for authorization. So the PEP goes to the PDP to fetch the information or the outcome of the authorization in order to see if it allows or not the agent. The agent only all it gets is a little token that says, well, this is the reference, pass it to the PEP, and the PEP will go and check. And the obviously you create an extra layer of security, because
mhm.
if you encrypt the assets as well, you can now create much more clever ways of accessing. uh, you can start tracking how many times somebody access an asset by doing it that way, for example, because your PDP and your PEP can work in tandem to make sure that accounting takes place.
Yeah, well, that's why you want, or you could just embed the PDP in the app, because it
As well,
also has
yes.
an audit
Yes.
log. Yeah,
Yes.
I published an article today about just comparing PEPs and narwhals. They're
Right.
like, um, you sort of like, oh, there's a narwhal. That's cool. You don't see that every day. So, I mean, I don't think PEPs are going to disappear, but I think that ideally we're just going to see that we're going to have to standardize how application developers import this code. Um, so, in your ideal world, would you like to see AI agents basically understand ODRL natively?
I think a lot of the desire in the market is that takes place, because what you would like to do is, when you do things like a delegation, you would like to ensure that the agent sort of understands what they can and cannot do without having to go and execute things and waste time because they cannot do something. That would be the first use case. But there's also the original use case, which is, in today's world, I have no way of restricting what the AI providers can do with the data that I have on my website. So if I have a way of creating policies that tell them this is what you can do, and you can use this subset of data for training, but you cannot use this data for training, or you will have to pay me for using
Yeah.
this part of the data for training, then the AI agent can make a decision. And as I said, you can also, because you can encrypt archives, for example, you can then only give them the key for decryption if they have fulfilled the obligations of payment. So you can create all of those things almost in an automated way without having any human intervention, because the rules are there and the endpoints for payments will be there, and everything is trackable because you will have all the logs of what the AI supplier is trying to achieve.
Hmm. Now, you had some thoughts about authzen as a protocol. I'm curious if you would like to share them.
I do love it. Before I discovered Outzen, in my journey, I was thinking a lot about doing a mapping between ODRL and any of the languages, Rego, OpenFGA, or Cedar now. That's the new that one of the newer ones. Um, but when I discovered, there's a use case that I discovered around a year ago, which is not is an inverted authorization requirement for insurers, where you have a set of policies of insurance policies that they'll tell you what you can and cannot do, and then they bundle them together. So I that use case is not an infrastructure use case, but they still need policies that are described in the same language. And what they want to know is if all the policies in one bundle are authorized to do whatever action. Again, there are no actions in the infrastructure case. They're just I don't know, payment of under a
Well,
hundred.
I'm gathering you needed a JSON REST endpoint for policy evaluation,
Yes,
basically.
yes.
Yeah.
But I started very basic. and saying, well, what is the minimum amount of information that I need to make a request? And I came up with the action, the
Principal action
action
resource.
asset. And then from there, I started developing very basic with strings, because all I had were the UI IDs of the assets in my graph.
Mhm.
And I came to Outzen, and I'm like, oh, well, this maps even better, because now I can have part of my, what we call the state of the world, that we're working on that in ODRL, to describe what is Mike's or Josh's state of the world in authorization. Um, I can then now expand it, and I can have it as part of the request if I want to, or it could be in a distributed place behind the PDP. So the PDP can go and access that state of the world. It doesn't need to come always from the client, but there will be always part of the information, mostly around the agent that is trying to do something. Only the client can tell me where the agent is. What is the IP address? I have no idea if it is behind a proxy and it is in Cuba in an embargo country. Only that client will be able to tell me what is the specific IP address of that agent. So it can travel on the request, but in principle, I should know everything about the asset. So the asset could be already in a cache somewhere behind, and allows me to obviously work in a much more efficient way, because nobody can give me fake asset descriptions if I don't want to.
Hmm. Um, I'm advocating for this new type of access control called token-based access control. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Uh, well, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends. For me, a token is more just a way of tracking. It should be a way of tracking without having a lot of information embedded into the actual request. So
You're talking about a reference ID, not
more,
a
yeah, for me, a
JWT
token is
token.
more a reference ID than anything else. In principle, I don't think there's anything particularly bad, but from some of the experience that I have seen companies have in the past, a lot of developers start overloading the tokens, and they
Uh-huh.
start putting too much in their payload. So eventually, they end up having massive amounts of information that could have been placed somewhere else. So for me, thinking about references, which is all that are needed,
Yeah.
is a much better way. Um,
Well, the reference ID ultimately gets traded for a payload, right? A JSON payload. And so I'm talking about the payload, whether that payload is delivered over MTLS channel or via a JWT.
yes,
Um, but so my question, but the nice thing about either of those delivery mechanisms involves trust, where we can verify that this is information from an issuer. Um, and so the token doesn't just include it doesn't just include the payload of claims, but it also includes the provenance that this is evidence that I processed. It's a legally validatable due to protection of the organizational private keys. Um, it's basically legal evidence on which you're acting. So, and an MTLS works the same way too. You're just doing
mhm,
it sort of in, you know, over a network connection. Ultimately, you still get the JSON payload, which should be delivered via MTLS anyway.
sure,
Um, the advantage of the token is it can be presented downstream for policy evaluation in your enterprise. Here's the piece of evidence I got that said I'm acting on this person's behalf. Um, yeah, well, let's pivot back to ODRL though. Um, so it sounds like, one of the challenges that you're talking about here is interoperability of policies. Auth only gets you like the interface. Here's how you send a park request, principal, action, resource, context, except they call principal subject.
mhm,
Um, right? But those four things, but Auth doesn't tell you how to express the policies. And it sounds like for you to really want to build trust, you would actually need interdomain for companies to know that they're going to have a certain expectation about how these policies will be interpreted and an audit log of how they were in fact acted upon. Do you
correct.
agree?
Yes, that's correct. Um, so some of the of the more complex use cases, obviously, will take a long time to describe. But in principle, you're right. And some of the pieces of work that I have been doing are, for example, to enable specific in the policy description specific channels where I want the output to go. So the PDP will be able to say, right, for these policies that the Mike has, I will go to this glue.com/telemetry, and
So like
it
a
will
federated or um,
exactly.
able to collect real-time dynamic information.
Correct. So there's sort of like the element of the what I can fetch in order to
Yeah.
make a decision, but there's an element of what I can push, and that push has to be dynamic because I don't want to.
Well, couldn't you all say that in a different way? Couldn't you say rather than I need to go fetch this piece of information dynamically, couldn't you say that in order to affect this policy, I must see an attestation or a signed assertion from this organization with this information that I need?
Yeah, you could look at it that way as well. So it is a possibility. The specific for me, the specifics are more about what is registered. So the attestation is the validation part, but what is registered is that I tried to execute the specific action over a
Hmm.
specific asset or assets, and maybe even the obligation. So a channel. Let's say that I have to pay via PayPal
Hmm.
on one of my duties, and PayPal is down at that specific time. Well, there will be the ability for you to track that I haven't paid yet, uh,
Hmm.
rather than having for me to go all the way again and execute my entire transaction. There could be timers that allow the obligations to say, well, 24 hours. You have 24 hours before you have to repeat the transaction, for example.
So there could be like clearinghouses for ODRL that maybe help facilitate some of these edge cases so that the
Correct.
customer doesn't like not see their asset.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
There's a in the Eclipse Foundation and in the Gaia X effort as well in Europe, there is the concept of clearinghouses. So they will be they're more enterprise level, like business to business. So I suppose the ability for or the likelihood of something failing is quite low. But in practice, if you think about the artists again, they will be dynamic and the users might be on the phone and they might be off signal. So it will be always a requirement somewhere for these clearinghouses to do that type of operation.
Um, one thing that I worry about when I hear about, oh, we're going to call this external service, is that um, basically authorization really needs to be low latency, but the types of obligations or requirements that you're putting on the PDP are complex and might also involve network failures and stuff. Um, at a certain point, maybe, or how do you, what are the risks of that giving up that low latency um, requirement?
That is a challenge, and that is one part of the pieces of work are related to how do you ensure that caching, for example, happens. Obviously, a catalog. If I have a catalog of my images, it might change once a day. So you have to start thinking about how do you also give control to the creator of the policy and the assets to say, well, I will change my catalog once a week, so you can cache this information for 5 days. So the amount of transactions that might fail due to or high latency turns to be low because that information could be somewhere close nearby to the PDP. So there's all sort of more engineering problems that are less related to the authentication. Sorry, the authorization itself, even the authentication that sits behind on how do you make that all that information accessible. And it's not only accessible; it's also, especially in the case of finance, it's also have to be compliant with like the ACID, like a database. So if you make if you only have the ability to access an asset once, I have to be able to also control that you only access that asset once. Or if you have a concurrency requirement that says that Mike can use this from his laptop, iPad, and mobile phone, concurrently can use it only from 3 devices. I need to have a way to make sure that that is also very similar to a database, and that's why also the graph is a very good way of expressing this, because you can build acid in a graph.
How does this all relate to risk? Because I was at Identiverse last week, and one of the Amazon presenters said capabilities equals risk, and it sounds like the ability to express these obligations, it's adding new capabilities. But now, if I'm an enterprise, I'm like, how do you think that this impacts sort of the risk management side of it?
In some cases, it should help reduce some of the risk. So in finance, one of the more common problems is that everyone has a contract that is expressed in their own language. It's still English, but the interpretation of that contract becomes sort of subjective, and there is a lot of payment of non-compliance of usage of the data downstream. And finance also is not only a seller and a buyer. In a lot of cases, a seller, a buyer. The buyer masticates the data and then creates a product, and that product is sold. So you can have downstream many people or many companies using your data. So in principle, once you start creating policies that allow you to express that human language in a more consistent way, with actions that are sort of also, you start creating vocabularies that are not hundreds of read like this or read like that. It just becomes read. You start creating better frameworks for you to reduce the risk overall. So in practice it should, but we'll have to see how it goes when it's implemented.
So basically, using ODRL, could help you quantify your risks, because at least you know what's there. It's sort of documented. Um, but how do AI agents sort of maybe aggravate that and create new possibilities for introducing risk or nonconformance?
Well, AI agents is that's part of the conversations that happen a lot with the area of authentication, which is an example that I like a lot is how Apple is thinking of implementing their AI agent, where you have your phone and you have Siri in your phone, but if Siri doesn't have the capabilities, it will go and reach into a model that is external. And now the question is, well, Siri might be my agent, but I have no idea what is the other agent, and I don't know what capabilities that agent has. And if I give them the ability to use my credit card to book my holiday,
Yeah.
how do I restrict them from doing that? Let's say that I want to enable my agent to do it only twice, or for the next 15 minutes, I want them to only be able to execute these actions. Well, all of that is more complicated when your agent is not only in your laptop or your phone, it's also on the internet, and you have to, now they have a different identity from your Siri and from you. They are not the same, or they shouldn't be the same. I don't know if they're at this stage. I think Siri is you, but it
Nobody
shouldn't.
nobody knows how to model this delegation from the end user, and my opinion is you would need to send a number of tokens to represent those delegations, the evidence of those delegations, just like you need to present a power of attorney.
Yes.
You would need to say, here are the tokens that show that this person signed at this date, and then here's a token saying that this person was actually authenticated. You probably need a bundle of evidence, and here's a platform attestation that says this was on a non-rooted device and that the person authenticated with a device-bound private key. So I think that yeah, you'll need a bunch of assertions in order to as evidence before you'd be able to achieve those allegations. And as far as I can tell, no one even has an answer for how to architect that yet. Um, but I guess so you think you're an enterprise. You think you're implementing ODRL properly. You introduce these new agents, and the agents maybe misunderstand the ODRL. Is that a possibility? And maybe you thought you were safe, but actually they didn't understand the thing in the first place, and they hallucinated something that's now a liability for you.
Uh, they shouldn't. I mean, even if they hallucinate, the PDP will still make sure that whatever they are attempting to do is within the boundaries. So if they imagine a new type of action over one of the assets, well, the PDP will say, I don't even know what this action is, so you cannot do it anyway. Um, I think one of the things that you just mentioned about the identification and how the problem with agents happens, I've tried to make a clear cut boundary between the part of the authentication and validation of who the agent is and how that agent is connected to a user or a machine or a process. And on the other side, you can have a very clean cut authorization that says, well, I already know that this agent is a valid agent. And a management plane can say, well, this agent is a delegate of Joshua. And Joshua has allowed this agent to do these specific actions by time or by number of iterations, and then every time that agent tries to come to the PDP, it will be restricted at the point where the new rules that have been created by the management plane between the delegate and the user happen. But all the other parts, I'm assuming that the agent is valid, that the agent has the right to talk to the PDP on your behalf. Because if you
Yeah.
bundle the problem, it just becomes too complicated.
Well, I don't think you can really extract these problems because the events that authenticated the user and the client authentication or workload authentication event, those are really foundational input to the policies. So you can say, I'm not going to talk about how that happens or how the agent gets a URI identifier, but you still have to say, my policies need to know that this agent was asymmetrically authenticated and that this human was authenticated with a phishing resistant. And here are the attested claims from a wallet or from an IDP.
Correct. Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yeah. All of that. But I'm not trying to. My boundary is before that conversation. So I'm assuming that that does work. It is
yeah,
part of the solution, but it is not part of the. It doesn't tangle with the problem that I'm trying to solve. Sort of
yeah.
like.
So I have another graph question for you.
Sure.
So ultimately, the graph, like you said, it's RDF, so it's a bunch of triples, which means that it's not human readable unless it's interpreted through some type of rendering engine. So
Sure.
you're only as good as the rendering engine that you're looking at the graph in. Do you think that that's a liability? And would it be better to have human readable policies that any human could read?
That's sort of my main goal. So in the work that I am doing, in my aspiration, the vision is that a person will come and talk to the builder environment, the IDE, and say, right, I want to create a policy over this specific asset, and the engine will fetch the asset and it will know what properties that asset has and what actions can be executed on that
So
asset.
like we call this like query-driven development, except they're
So
not developers, they're business analysts, right?
yes, yeah, it could be. I call them product owners because there's a lot of people in the data world that are moving now to be what is a product owner. So they will own a bunch of data sets. So they
Uh-huh.
have to establish the set of rules that those data sets need to comply, because it could be some of them are theirs and some of them are from third parties. But it is, yeah, it's similar to that a query creation, but a little bit more sophisticated because it's about um, many parts of the problem. You have to start by creating policies that are very simple at the top, and then creating specialization. So you are saying, well, I want to, if I have a data catalog, I want to import this policy as my ancestor, so I can base all my current rules for this specific catalog based on this. Oh, it's a multimedia, it's a Netflix catalog, so I have this other policy.
Yeah, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to use a bunch of boilerplate template. And
Correct. Yes.
I agree with the prompt-driven development in collaboration, maybe with some starting templates. You know, if this is a chess game, you have your opening pattern and then you have your middle game, and so maybe it's a combination. Um,
Correct. Yes. Yes.
um, so I wanted to ask maybe one last question before we go to last thoughts. So you mentioned there's a possibility of an ODRL3
Yes.
that there are some things that some syntaxes that maybe you can do in some of the new policy languages that you can't quite do in ODRL2 or 2 dot whatever it is now.
2.2, yeah.
Could you maybe just before we wrap up, give some thoughts on where ODRL is headed?
Yes. So this is all at the moment is mostly ideas of things that we're proposing based on conversations with specific users that have requirements. So the first one is in today's definition, because originally it was thought as my catalog and it was all internal. When I create this policy that is my boilerplate, I can only import all the rules when I'm creating a specialization. But when I'm buying your data, you might be selling me a policy that has all sorts of rules of all sorts of elements, and I want to handpick some of those rules from your policy because I'm only setting a subset of your assets in my
Yeah.
specialization. So that extension is something that we are trying to work on.
And
Um,
what about schema? That inheritance feature. There's a parallel conversation in the Cedar community about object inheritance, and people laugh at me because I talk about LDAP object classes and how you could extend. One object class could extend another, which was like the union of those almost table schemas, let's say.
yes.
Um, but yeah, can you also mention a little bit about? So, is there any talk about standardizing schema, not just the policies, but how do you describe the data itself?
Well, the way that it works, because it's all an open standard. For example, when you want to describe your catalogs and your data sets and your records, there's a standard called DCAT. And when you want to describe your data products, now there's a new standard called DPROD. So you can use them, and they have by definition already a has policy, and that has policy is an ODRL policy. So you could create your catalog. And one interesting fact is that the people that were working on the JPEG and the new version of JPEG, they created a bunch of properties. And when they sent me the document for review back in February, I read it and I said, "This looks very familiar." And I asked them, "Did you use DCAT for your as your baseline?" And I said, "No, this is just us coming with the properties that we needed from all the other vocabularies." And it was a match to the DCAT resource. So a DCAT resource, which is the data catalog, is DCAT, what stands for, matches the JPEG trust almost entirely on the properties. So a catalog or a data set in DCAT can hold that already a catalog of JPEG images without any problem. So you have all of that already defined, and all you would need to do when you're trying to create your own definition of an object is just use an open standard and say an RDF and say, well, has policy and is an ODRL policy, and you close the loop.
I interrupted you on the future of ODRL, or I sidetracked you. So I
Sure.
wanted to come back to that and then go to last thoughts. So what's the thing in ODRL 3.0 that would you be the most excited about?
I think templates. There's a lot of requirement for the managing user data, GDPR style, and you cannot think of creating, in the case of Europe, 500 million policies in advance. You need to have a way of saying, I am an insurer, and Mike wants to come and get a policy for insurance. I will go to a repository somewhere and I will fetch what are the policies that are relevant for my use case. And at the point in time when Mike has made the request, I create that policy, and that
Right.
policy exists. So that is something that I think is very exciting for anyone that is interested in managing data at user level, at an individual self-sovereign data is what they're calling it mostly.
Hmm. Okay. That was an interesting conversation. Just want to give you a couple of minutes at the end to um, promote anything. So, any last thoughts before we break?
Uh, sure, yeah. So basically, we are. I mean, it's an open community. We meet once a month for the ODRL standard. You can go to the W3C website to engage with the conversation. There's a separate meeting that I'm leading that happens once a month or once every 2 months, where we come and discuss requirements that could be incorporated into ODRL 3.0. As I said at the beginning, it's a very slow, painful process because it's an open standard and you have to get everyone to agree with everything in order to make sure that you go somewhere. But it's a very friendly community. We have people from banks, we have people from academia, and it's mostly, I think at this stage, is mostly from anyone that is interested in how they're going to be using policies in the near future to come and engage, so that no use case is missed.
Hmm. Okay, it's super relevant. Just want to introduce the next episode. Staying on the impact of AI agents, the next big challenge of AI agents, access and authentication. The co-founder of Natoma, one of the new machine identity, let's say, or non-human identity companies. So next week, or no, this coming Thursday, should be interesting. And with that, I will say thanks to the audience. Thanks a lot, Joshua. That was a great conversation. See a lot of interesting possibilities about mapping ODRL to, like you say, a catalog of CEDAR templates. I think that could be very interesting. So thank you for giving me something to think about today. Um, and yeah, thanks again, and we'll see you soon, audience.
Perfect.